It won't surprise me if you need time to think about it, because this is not the kind of chatter that you normally have to put up with.
I missed the title of your book, Life is a...
Miracle. Well, sorry. The Peter Crave one is The Best Things in Life, and it's published by InterVarsity Press. Life is a Miracle is a book by Wendell Berry, which is the best pro-life essay I know. Starts with a meditation on King Lear. Any other questions? Now, one of the things we teach you if you came to Augustine College is to ask questions. And, yes? It's a very good question, Ty. I don't. I grew up on missionary biographies. People don't read missionary biographies anymore. We ought to re-establish that pattern. I mean, my favourite mission is not a missionary biography, but how many of you know who Charles Simeon is, for instance? One at the back, yeah. Two. An amazing story. Put Charles Simeon into Google. Evan Hopkins is better than John Piper, but you probably just find John Piper. But nevertheless, he was the founder of the missionary movement of the 19th century in many ways. A major impact on it. Yes, Ross?
What does Darwinian mean when he says protein or function in a certain way?
What? Can you repeat that?
What does Darwinian mean when he says a protein function?
Yeah, sorry, quite right. I left that hanging in midair. I didn't take it all the way. Once we got to genes, we had to ask what they do. So we had to express them. And then we got a molecule that looked like a cat's cradle, a ball of wool that a cat had played with. When nobody saw the beauty of proteins when we first got 3D proteins. It took time to realize how they worked. So again, you were forced into the question, what does it do? You cannot escape teleology in the modern world. And that it's happening in biology is just hilarious. And they hate it when you say, what's the teleological question that we need to ask? Actually use the words and force them to choke on it. It's fun to do. So they have to do it. There's no other way to go, is there? And it's true in so much science, isn't it? We discover things and that's curious. What on earth does it do? The most interesting paper in my CV, from my point of view, that I still get questions about, it's nearly 40 years since I wrote it, and I still get emails about it because I still don't understand it, but it saved thousands of lives. And that was, instead of dismissing 4 or 5 outlying points on the 5 standard deviation rule, my mother's impact on my backside, you ought at least to look them up. I found I'd stumbled on an indicator of late refeeding deaths in malnutrition. And the data suggested a curious way that we might approach it, but it was unethical at first sight. But of course it wasn't unethical if we could catch them before they died. They died very quickly and we missed them. So the next one that came along, we put on constant watch, so to speak, and gave digoxin to a potassium deficient child, and the child survived. And I got a couple more, and slowly I got people in the Western world didn't believe it. People who dealt with these children said it works. And then later on we got a clinical way of doing it, which is even better. Don't ever feed a malnourished child till they're hungry. You've got to wait for the appetite to come back, which can mean 3 weeks of patience sometimes. But it's a good example of data that you didn't throw it away, you looked at it and thought about it. And in the process of thinking, other things happen. We don't know where our thoughts come from. I mean, my favourite way of opening up this particular discussion is to say, to Christians anyway, does God think? Can you say no? I don't think so. So if God thinks, what does he think with? He doesn't have a brain. Jesus tells us he is pure spirit. So thoughts are not just brain products, because God thinks. He thought us into existence. So brains may be just thought processing machines and not the source of the thoughts. Nobody knows where they come from. Nobody can describe consciousness in a meaningful way. We're meant to be sowing doubt about the reductionistic world, and it's easy to do, and it's fun if you've got a malicious sense of humour like mine. Yes? You'd have to be loud, because as well as curmudgeonly, I'm getting deaf, you know?
What do you think about the practice of publishing only papers that have statistical significance in the data rather than looking at all of the research?
Well, yeah. That's a big question. Because, of course, there's lots of junk in the literature already. But absolutely right, that data that fits with what they already know, it gets published. And data that doesn't, that's the hardest thing to publish. The hardest paper in my CV took me 4 years to bully the editors into publishing because it attacked a paradigm that was held by all the leading figures in the area. But it turned out I was right. Getting published is not a rational process. And you only have to look at any academic. You give them a paper and the first thing they do is look at the references to see whether you've quoted them. And if you haven't, you'll be on their blacklist for next time they review something of yours. And, they play games with all these self-referring things and indirect refer. It's all sorts. There's no ethics there anymore. When I started in science, we made our own equipment. And you did science if you had a medical degree at a loss of income. So there was very little cheating. And in fact, if you were at the Physiological Society, Adrian would sit in the front row with his pocket calculator redoing your statistics while you were presenting and then taking you apart in public and then taking you out for a beer. That was a good world. You learned to take criticism, which modern students can't take at all. They are such tender plants that being told they're wrong is needs a micro warning or a herd of Labradors or whatever a group of Labradors are, It is an utterly ridiculous world we're living in, and we need to change it. So your question is a huge one, not an easy answer. But you're foolish if you don't recognize that you need publications at certain times. I have to tell students, you've got to be cynical. At one level. Look at the previous exams, see what kinds of nonsense they're going to ask you. That you memorize on the night before or the week before. But as a Christian, start thinking right from the beginning, what have I learned today that might be of permanent significance? Write that down on a filing card so that you can put it in a stack and pull them out at random and build a steady supply of real learning that you properly understand. That becomes very impressive later on. But you have to do the memorize and dump because that's what they're testing you on at the moment in many areas. But at the same time, thumb your nose at them by being cynical about that and also learning solidly what matters, what seems to you important. You won't be recognized before third year in university because up to that point you're being marked by TAs who don't know what they're doing. It's a sad world we live in, and cynicism is the only way to handle it that I know of. I'm sorry, but that seems to be the way to go. Yes?
What is that term you use in describing genetic teleological?
Oh, my goodness. Yvonne, your honesty is wonderful. It does you credit. But teleology means purpose. T-E-L-E-O. Teleology. Telos, purpose, Greek word. And of course, we live purposeless lives now, so it's not surprising we don't understand it. But we need it. If I put meaning and purpose into a lecture, I'll get a crowd. And Jordan Peterson told me the same thing. He said, when I started talking about a meaningful life, there was a vertical takeoff. How many of you have not come across Jordan Peterson yet? Oh, most of you. Well, you've got something of interest, and you can pray for him as well. He's a Canadian professor of psychology who decided to take on the politically correct elements of the university. From psychology, of all places. He's still got hang-ups in that area, but they're being shredded off him slowly. But he refused to use their pronouns for the genderists. And he said, I won't do it because it's intellectual death. You cannot choose your gender. It's a biological given. You can talk about your feelings, and that's the way he took them on head first. I don't do it that way. When I get this question asked to me, I sidestep it to a degree. I say, well, let me point out the problem you're raising for me. I've spent a lot of my life talking to young women with anorexia nervosa who think they are fat when they're actually thin to the degree of being liable to die in the next few months. But if you're right about gender, then it also applies to fat and thin. So I shouldn't do anything, right? None of them are going to say yes to that. I said, well, do you want an incoherent or a coherent world? You've got to choose. You've got to be able to make the case. And everybody actually wants a coherent world. Peterson. Now, so, of course, they immediately manufactured a minor riot, but he wasn't intimidated. They went to the administration who said, you've got to bend. He said, no way. He's got tenure. They couldn't do anything about it. But the Social Sciences Research Council didn't give him a grant for the first time in 25 years. He'd been the most funded academic psychologist in Canada up to that point. This is clear politics. So he's a nice man. He had a lot of graduate students, and he was worried that his stubbornness was going to destroy their careers. And he woke up one night, he said, I'm going to fight back. And he went downstairs and he made a vlog of his first lecture. And he's done, I don't know how many now, 50, 60. And he's getting around 500,000 views on each one within a few weeks. And most of them going there are young men. So he realized this is quite an audience. So he went on one of these crowdfunding sites, Patronym or something like that, and he raised the money that he would have had from his grant in 1 month, so all his students were covered. And his life has been totally turned upside down because he's being asked to go everywhere. Sometimes he gets shouted down, but most often he doesn't, because they shouted him down a few times. But now a lot of students coming want to hear him, and they are not prepared to let this noisy minority of so-called activists shut him down. So he says the shut-down thing has almost died because they know he's getting 500,000 views. They can't pretend this is unacceptable. People want it. And what's so attractive is his passion for truth and his love of students, and that's why they want to listen to him. And he's doing a better job than we're doing as Christians. And he's even doing a series on Genesis now, which is very interesting, done from a psychological point of view. But I mean, his opening was brilliant. When I heard him, I said, I'm going to use that. I'll try and remember to give you credit. But he said, isn't it amazing, this book, the Bible? It's more enduring than stone. It's been around for a few thousand years. Stone buildings have disappeared in that time, but the Bible is still going. So anybody who wants to dismiss it really has a bit of an intellectual problem, don't they? You should take it seriously. Why has it survived? Lovely introduction to Genesis. He's someone to know about and to watch and to pray for. He's very close to the kingdom, and we should pray for him. But he's doing things and saying things we couldn't, and they know he's not a Christian, so he can say them. So maybe God will keep him in limbo a bit longer. But the world is moving in our direction. We shouldn't be upset. The apologetics movement is amazing. The other thing that's really amazing to me is the change in attitude towards sexuality, which I hope I'll get round to tomorrow. Amongst serious Christians, anyway. Yes? A little louder, please. Sorry.
What's the name of the professor who found the 2 proteins from the 1 section?
I've forgotten his name. I'm sorry. I've reached that stage. Tomorrow morning it might come back, but on the other hand, it might be next week. Yeah. But he's in Seattle. I'm sure if you put double reading frame into Google, you'll get back to him. Or call the Discovery Institute, they'll tell you. They're next door. Yes.
Reductionism has affected, I think, the education system and the biomedical research field. I want to hear your words for this, ongoing kind of activities, particularly for people who are in the career development time period. What's your encouragement?
I'm not sure I've understood you properly, unfortunately. Can you put it so that your voice is a little bit deeper and a little bit easier for me? I apologize. I've got to get something done about my ears, but I couldn't get enough.
What I'm trying to say is reductionism has affected, education.
Oh, yes. Very.
Biomedical research area, almost every area. So, as an educator,
Okay.
I want to hear your
Yeah, fine. Well, my problem with reductionism in education is very straightforward. It goes to 1 Timothy 3. Even as a little boy, I used to read things and pick up things that didn't fit. Now, I asked somebody who's here somewhere about 1 Timothy 3 in education, but I can't see him at the moment. He's in the audience somewhere, I think. He's at the back, yeah. He's probably looking at 1 Timothy 3 now. Yes, he is. But in the middle of this is the requirements for leadership in the church. And there's one comment about education in that list, and it's fascinating. Anybody know where it is? In order to lead in the church, you must, in the King James, be apt to teach. Apt. Very interesting word. It's not something you learn to do. It's a gift. And at the heart of education is two loves, not skill. You must love the pupil and you must love the subject. And you cannot teach love. Hence, the Faculty of Education should be disbanded. They can do research, but they cannot pretend to teach teachers. Neither can they pretend to know what makes a great teacher, because nobody knows, except that it contains those two loves. And I know that's true. One of the things that had to happen to me to drag me out of my ivory tower, quite unjustifiably, I actually got a teaching award from the students. Now, if anybody didn't deserve a teaching award, it was me. And there was a Chinese professor in our department who said to me, "How long do you spend preparing undergraduate lectures?" And I flippantly said, "Well, 20 minutes is a bit excessive, isn't it?" I never even made overheads because it took too much time. And he said, "You're not actually joking, are you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "I spend hours on mine and they trash me and they give you an award." I said, "Well, I tease them a bit. I try and be interesting, and I actually want them to have a more enjoyable time." And I think they picked that up. But the real point is that it's a gift. Now, I've been well brought up, so I knew that if you have gifts, you have responsibilities. So the only way I could avoid the gift was to be irresponsible, which is what I'd been doing for years. And that had to change. I didn't actually give the gift back to God with no strings attached until I was 55. It's a bit late. And I was, of all places, in the most unhappy place on earth that summer. In the summer of 1955, I went out to see my wife, who I hadn't seen for a year, because she'd been running refugee camps following the Rwanda War. She was in charge of 4 or 5 refugee camps. I'd had a project running on the borders of Rwanda for 10 years, so we knew the area, and we were there when the war blew up in 94. Our youngest child was going to university that year, so I knew Sally was not going to come back in September, because there were 7-year-olds trying to care for 4-year-olds, and she wouldn't walk away from that, and she didn't. So I went out in the summer of 95 to see her. My research in the area was in ruins because the war had wrecked everything, including the Zairian side, as it was then, DRC as it is now. So I actually said in my prayers, I knew Sally would find a decent place to be, and Bukavu, if it was a peaceful place, would be one of the world's tourist meccas. The temperature is about 80 degrees all the year round. There's not a serious insect problem. It's got mountains behind it. The gorillas are of the GOR variety are a few miles away. You can even see the only snow there is on the equator on an appropriate day. I never got to climb the Ruwenzori. I always wanted to, but never got round to it. Anyway, I said to God, I've got nothing to do this summer. If you've got anything for me, I'll gladly do it. I'd never done that in my life. I'd done Christian things when my life sort of began to turn around. But I'd always decided what Christian things I would do, not God. And he took me seriously. And Sally said, well, you can start by talking to the leaders of my refugee camps. They want to talk to you. They wouldn't talk to the people from the peace and reconciliation programs in the West. They said, they don't understand us. They've got nothing to tell us. But I was known and Sally was known. So they wanted to talk to me. So off I went. And we talked for about 3 hours. And then we got to the question, can you help us to understand how we who call ourselves Christian ended up killing one another? 80% of Rwandans went to church. And people had killed people they'd sat next to in church simply for belonging to the other tribe. And it wasn't a planned genocide. That's a fabrication. It was an outpouring of evil vindictiveness. Normally, in the history of the two tribes, the Tutsi have been the killers. This was the first time that the Hutu really went mad. And the sheer numbers, they overwhelmed the Tutsi. They did not expect that. But the Hutu, who were the ones who lost in the end, were in the camps, and they were actually repentant for what they'd done. They said, how could we do that? Now, it so happened I'd been prepared for that discussion via David Jeffrey, who'd written a book about how Christianity had worked out over time, including the brutal tribal warfare in Britain in the 5th century, which was brought to an after Christianity got there. It got bad again under the influence of the Vikings and the Norsemen. But Gregory the Great sent the missionaries, and reconversion was swift, but social development was slow. And that's always the case. I mean, the day after you are converted, are you good? You're not, are you? Goodness is an entirely different process. And it's goodness that's required for government and for even self-control. It doesn't work that way. So we talked for a bit, and they said, can you do some talks? And I said, well, I think there are 4 talks that might help you. The first would be to tell you the history of religion in the world in a broad brush sense, so that you can realize every group has been killers. Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, we've all done it. The biggest killers by far, secularists. The 20th century secular killers are by far and away the biggest. And they think they're doing a good thing. 50 million abortions a year is a good thing, as far as they're concerned. So, and they have no repentance at all. They have no guilt. But I'll tell you the story so you realize you're not unusual. And what helped with them can help with you. Next, you need your theology of salvation deepened, because you have a salvation theology which is largely one event in the past, whereas Paul wants you to have how you're saved every day. Being saved, not being saved. And we can go through that. Then you need to develop a Christian character, and I can do that from the Sermon on the Mount. And finally, your big problem is fathers don't do their job. You need to become Jewish fathers. And I can teach you that from Deuteronomy 6. And I've been in Africa every summer for 10 years. I knew that I should define carefully how many times I would do that. I didn't bother. I ended up teaching between 3 and 6 hours a day, every other day for the next 2 months in the refugee camps. I was in tears. They were in tears. And I was simultaneously the most happy man on earth. Because this time, it wasn't objective, it was subjective. I felt his pleasure. And that is intoxicating. I had given the gift back to the giver, and he gave it back better than it had been before. Fenelon says that in one of my favourite quotes from Fenelon, one of my favourite authors. He said, there is no gift which God gives us that he doesn't usually have to take away. Not to take it away permanently, but to remove the evil sense of ownership that we attach to it. Fenelon is right. Every gift has to be recognized as what it is, a gift. We don't own it. We have it on loan. has got to be used. Probably enough bad thoughts for the evening, right? If you wake up tonight, I will have done a good job.